Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Silveira. I'm a professor at University of Florida, and it is my pleasure to serve as your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the USDA Climate Hubs and the Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network, I'd like to welcome you to the first presentation in this series of 11 webinars focused on grazing land management and soil carbon. The goal of this series is to provide an update on the knowns and unknowns about the influence of management on soil carbon dynamics in grazing lands of the continental United States. Today's presentations will be followed by a short Q&A section, so please type your questions for the speaker in the Q&A tool at any time, either during or after the presentation. Today's webinar will also conclude promptly at 45 minutes past the hour. The title of today's presentation is The Language of Grazing Lands Research, and today's speaker is Dr. Lynn Sollenberger. Dr. Lynn Sollenberger is a distinguished professor of agronomy and forage crops in the Department of Agronomy at University of Florida. He's also the graduate student coordinator in the department and a distinguished teaching scholar. Dr. Lynn Sollenberger research program is focused on plant, animal, environmental interactions with special emphasis on ecosystem services of grazing lands. Dr. Sollenberger teaches both undergrad and graduate student courses to focus on grassland ecology and management. He's a tremendous mentor, and many of his mentees occupy numerous university faculty positions, as well as serve on national and international research organizations. Dr. Sollenberger is also a prolific writer. He has published more than 320 peer-reviewed journal articles and more than 27 book chapters. He's a fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science, Crop Science Society of America, and the American Society of Agronomy. He has an extensive list of awards, including the 2024 University of Florida Teacher Scholar of the Year, which is the highest faculty honor presented by University of Florida. With that, Dr. Sollenberger, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to visit with you today, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the privilege of this visit. I was asked to develop a presentation on terminology in grasslands research, and so I've given the talk the title, The Language of Grazing Lands Research. Now, you probably recognize, and I definitely do, that a comprehensive treatment of grassland terminology would take us much more than 20 minutes. But even 20 minutes might exceed your overall interest in this topic. As you can see, it might be considered a bit of a yawner. So we're going to use somewhat of a slimmed down approach. And these are the main things that we will consider. We're going to try to provide reasons why correct and standard terminology is important in science, generally speaking. Then we'll apply that and explore some of the specific challenges related to grassland science. We'll then provide some examples illustrating the importance of standard terminology. And I'd like to then also give you what I consider to be kind of the state-of-the-art guide to our way forward in achieving an appropriate terminology. So let's begin by thinking about why a standard terminology is important. I would make the argument that specifically defined and consistently used words are critical in developing and clearly communicating science. Use of ill-defined or undefined terms, in contrast then, is a barrier to our understanding, and it really gets in the way, as we'll point out in just a few minutes, of synthesis of existing knowledge and putting it into a form that is broadly available. Are there exceptions to this need for clarity or the most current and understandable technology? Perhaps, and one of those may be when engaging a producer audience. I would again make the argument in this case that it is better to be understood than to be technically correct. So I would use terms in speaking to a producer audience that I would not necessarily use in a scientific paper or talk. Just for example, for a producer audience, I would use the terminology forage variety when actually forage cultivar would be the preferred term. I might use rotational grazing instead of the preferred rotational stalking, or I might use yield instead of forage accumulation. Again, all in an effort to be understood by a particular audience. Now, within the context of grassland science, we have some problems. We are a pretty creative bunch, and creating new and vague terms can really be a very useful technology marketing strategy, I've observed, or it may help us as we try to develop new buzzwords. We are also a fairly stubborn bunch with a fierce streak of independence. We don't really appreciate having people tell us what words we should use to describe responses that are of interest to us. And as a result of some of our inherent traits, the progress that we have made toward developing a standard terminology in grassland science has been slow to evolve. I'd like to just illustrate the point of this slow development and a problem that is associated with it by discussing a personal encounter that I had with the terminology problem in grassland science. Some of you may be aware of this publication from 2012, edited by Jerry Nelson. It was a USDA NRCS publication looking at some of the conservation outcomes associated with implementing various NRCS recommendations. As part of the process, I was involved, along with several of my colleagues, in a particular chapter which looked at grazing recommendations on pasture land. As part of the process, my co-authors and I, we reviewed over 1,000 papers. And along with understanding and learning some really cool science, we also learned that grassland terminology in the scientific literature had some issues. One, across the grassland scientists, is highly variable. And even within a given research report, a single paper, it was quite inconsistent in many cases. And in sometimes it was a real head scratcher. We had really no idea what the author had done in terms of protocol or what responses they had measured. As a result, many of those papers that we reviewed were uncitable, and we really could not translate their results into useful recommendations. One of my former colleagues referred to this dilemma as the fog factor, where either the methodology or the terminology and the description of that methodology using appropriate terminology was so vague that the transfer of understanding was a bit foggy. Contrasting that to this scenario, both pictures taken of the Golden Gate Bridge, by the way, we would argue that clearing the fog by utilizing appropriate and standard terms then allows the inherent beauty and value of the research or the message that you're communicating to come through. I mentioned that I would provide a recommended resource for terminology of grazing lands, and this is it. It's a paper developed by Vivian Allen and a group of stalwart international colleagues with very high reputations in grassland science. And they worked together to develop this publication that came out in 2011 in Grass and Forage Science. And it is kind of the gold standard for terminology in grazing lands research. For the second half of the talk, what I'd like to do then is to focus on these three particular areas just to illustrate some aspects of appropriate terminology. This will be far from comprehensive and it will be fairly generalized. I'm going to look at stocking method and terminology related to stocking method, forage quantity, and then also just talk briefly about grazing jargon. So talking first of all about stocking method, terms like rotational and continuous stocking are actually the preferred terms instead of rotational and continuous grazing. So why is that? Well, the part that is rotational or continuous is actually how the animals are allocated to pastures or stocked, and it is not actually the grazing process. Hence the preference for rotational and continuous stocking. Another terminology related to stocking method that I would like to talk about briefly is the term mob stocking. This is a term that was defined very clearly by Allen and her group, and they described it as a method of stocking at a high grazing pressure for a short time with the goal to remove forage rapidly as part of an overall management strategy. You might have seen this or referred to it as strip stocking. Now, in recent years, a concern has been that the term has been somewhat hijacked and other elements have been added to this definition of stocking method, and particularly mob stocking. Specifically, what has been added? Well, long periods of pasture rest or regrowth between grazing events have essentially been merged with the standard definition of stocking method. So in effect, the definition has been expanded. The problem, and there are several of them, is that mob stocking has actually nothing to do with the length of rest period. The rest period under mob stocking can be short, it can be intermediate, it can be long. So one of the challenges then is when seeing or hearing mob stocking, a given reader or listener who is somewhat familiar with this merging of definitions may perceive that extremely long rest periods were implemented, even when mob stocking was used according to the original definition. Likewise, then, some of us who use mob stocking in our research programs, we may not actually wish to be associated with the long rest period philosophy, but to those who have been exposed to that aspect of the definition tend to then perceive what we have done in that manner. Let's talk briefly then about some aspects related to forage quantity. So let's begin by thinking about what kinds of terms we actually need to have to describe forage quantity. We need a term that we can use to describe how much forage is here right now. We need to be able to describe how much did the amount of forage change over time. So let's look at those issues. First, how much forage is here right now? And this is primarily a grazed pasture example in this case. Allen's group came up with the terminology and the term specifically of forage mass. They define forage mass as the total weight of forage per unit of area of land at a specific time. So this works very well for scenarios in which we simply are interested in a point in time measure of quantity, and in effect then we are measuring forage mass. We might also be interested in that second question that I posed. how much did the amount of forage change over time? So let's first consider a hayfield example. This is a research plot where quantity of forage is being measured. Assuming that the clipping height is the same in this particular defoliation event as in the previous one, then we are actually measuring here terms that we could use interchangeably, either forage accumulation or forage harvested. Basically, these terms can be defined as a change in forage mass, which we already mentioned, over time. And these terms account for several dynamic processes that occur in grasslands, including growth, senescence, and decomposition. We might also be interested in how much the quantity of forage changed over time in grazed pastures. In the grazed pasture situation, we have to think in terms of scenarios where we're using rotational stocking or continuous stocking. With rotational stocking, then we ask the question, what do we need? Well, we need a measure of post-grazing forage mass, which is basically that instantaneous measure as the animals are leaving a given paddock. We also need pre-grazing forage mass, again, another instantaneous measure as they are about to return to the same paddock. And then effectively the change in forage mass between those two sampling events is called forage accumulation. For continuous stocking, what do we need? Well, we need some way of restricting animal grazing from our sampling units because the animals are on the pasture for extended periods of time. And so we need exclusion cages. Specifically then, we need to know the forage mass at the time of cage placement inside the cage and the forage mass, again, inside the cage at cage removal. So then what did we measure? Again, we measured forage accumulation, which is change in mass over time. Some of you may be curious or asking yourself along with the terms yield, growth, or production as measures of quantity. So let me address that briefly. These terms refer to tissue accumulation only, and we rarely actually measure or report tissue accumulation. We actually involve or overlay processes like tissue senescence and decomposition in our measurement. So forage accumulation or forage harvested then accounts for the combination of all of those dynamic processes of growth, senescence, and decomposition into effectively one measurement. Lastly, then, I would like to address the issue of grazing jargon briefly. There are tons of examples of grazing or grassland jargon. I've just listed a few of them. In some cases, people refer to adaptive or multi-paddock grazing. They may talk in terms of management-intensive grazing or high-intensity, short-duration grazing, or even regenerative grazing. These are some examples. I would propose that there are some problems associated with some aspects of grazing jargon. In many cases, the criteria for management, in other words, the management recipe for these really cool sounding practices are often not well defined. So they effectively have a recipe that is not specific, and it's similar to perhaps what Grandma passed along, recommending a pinch of this or a smidge of that. But the problem is that it's not possible for others to replicate. The challenge then, and one of the problems that I have seen, is that this allows the advocate of the technology or the marketer of a technology to blame observed failures of the technology on others who did not implement it correctly. But of course, in terms of replicating grandma's recipe, the pinch and the smidge are hard to really translate into teaspoons and ounces. Likewise, technologies that are inadequately described are difficult to implement, either in terms of a controlled research or a producer field location. So let me quickly wrap up then. I make the argument that a consistent standard terminology is critical to communicating scientific concepts and findings, as well as describing grazing management practices, those recipes that we talked about. In general, I think we can say that grassland scientists have been slow, somewhat reluctant to adapt terminology standards. And lastly, I would propose that the paper by Allen et al. And her international colleagues be used as a standard terminology in grassland science because, from my perspective and that of many others, it provides an excellent way forward. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take this opportunity to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sollenberger. Just a reminder for the audience, you can type your questions in the Q&A tool, and I'll relay the questions to Dr. Sollenberger. Dr. Sollenberger, we have a question in the chat right now. This question is for Dr. Betsy Balton, and she's asking, since many studies attempted to look at how grazing intensity changes ecosystem services, or I'm sorry, ecosystem function, but grazing regimes can vary in time, duration, frequency. Some have proposed a unified measurement of percentage of utilization. What do you think of this, and how would you recommend to measure grazing intensity?
Right. Okay. Thank you, Maria, and thanks, Betsy, for that question. So maybe the first statement I would make is that in kind of as I've looked at some of the ecological literature, particularly, it has been what I would consider to be somewhat of a shortcoming in that many comparisons are based on grazing versus no grazing. And to me, that is somewhat short-sighted because it fails to take into account the importance of grazing management. And so grazing can occur across a huge range of measures of frequency and intensity. So then specifically in terms of a measure of grazing intensity, we've found that in some of our grazing experiments, particularly where we're looking at kind of different settings in terms of different species that may have very different growth habits, that a measure like the one described in this question may be very useful. In other words, in some cases, we have described intensity as the percentage of pre-grazing height that was removed during a grazing event. And that has worked effectively for species that have varying growth habits. Others have used a percentage of pre-grazing forage mass or related types of measurement. So I think in response to Betsy's question, yeah, I think that's you're headed in what would be a useful direction in terms of describing grazing intensity across a range of situations in terms of some proportion of removal, either in terms of height or mass.
Thank you. Well, I have a follow-up question also related to that. You mentioned that the importance of having this standardized terminology, especially in the scientific literature. But and probably some of the goals in grazing land research has changed over time. So what do you think would be the right pathway when it comes to creating new terms to describe grazing management practice? Would that be a good idea, or how do we go about that?
Right. So, I am I'm fairly advanced in my career here, so I don't want to come off as the stodgy old timer. And we recognize that in language as well as in science, there is a continual need for refreshing of that language and of that terminology. What I would suggest is, first of all, that if we are simply giving a different name to something that has already been defined, I would have some concerns about that process. I think we can all come up and develop our own unique terms that we might like, but that gets in the way when we're talking about a community of scientists in terms of communication. However, there clearly is going to be the need for new terms as we move forward in science. And the only thing I would ask is that that terminology be very clearly defined, so that the reader, the person trying to utilize that terminology, is very clear on how it should be utilized, how it should be implemented, and what it actually means.
Thank you. There's another question, Dr. Sollenberger, from Andreas Sibos from USDA Climate Hubs, and it's kind of related to that creating new terminology. So Andreas' question is, how would we conduct systems research about grazing recipes described within the jargon terms you mentioned?
Okay. What I would like to see personally would be clear description of decision points and decision criteria. So, for example, people talk a lot about adaptive grazing. That's fine. I mean, I grew up on a farm. I spent 22 years on a dairy farm in northeastern US, and producers have to be responsive to changes in situations. However, simply calling it adaptive doesn't tell me much as someone who would be interested perhaps in implementing an adaptive approach to grazing. What am I supposed to look at? What am I supposed to adapt to? And then once I make an observation, what are the criteria, or how do I utilize that observation to make decisions? So I think those are really the key points that we would need to emphasize. So, what are those key decision points? And then what are the criteria that we use to make a decision about where to go in terms of adapting to a current set of conditions?
There's also another question, kind of related. You mentioned, the importance of having this standardized, clear message. But if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you match that terminology with a different audience. You mentioned that if you're talking to producers, you may use an incorrect terminology. So could you please go back to that and elaborate a little bit more, please?
Sure. So there is this interesting dynamic between perhaps academics/scientists and the production community, and I've sat on both sides of that fence, and so I've experienced it going in both directions. As someone who spent a lot of time trying to communicate, either in written or oral forms, you need to know your audience, and the most important goal of any type of communication is establishing clear and concise ways of expressing yourself to that given audience. recognizing that you potentially will be talking to a range of audiences, it's important to understand the nature of the audience you're talking to. And within this specific context of use of, quote, standard terminology, that which we might find in Allen et al., versus terminology that may be more common in a production community. Within the context that I work, I typically would utilize that, quote, non-standard terminology with practitioners, meaning producers or perhaps advisors who are relatively new to the game. Whereas I would use more standard or accepted terminology when I'm talking to a group of scientists or perhaps to those whom I would consider advisors who are discipline experts who are experienced and well-versed in that terminology. So really, the take-home lesson is to adapt the terminology to meet the needs of the audience that you're speaking to.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience. Francisco Moral is asking, what is the definition of nominal pasture?
I saw that one flash across the screen in my chat, and I hope that we didn't get to it. I have to admit, and I apologize to do so, but I have never heard that term. So that may reflect the population of folks that I work with or my ignorance, but I apologize that I can't help you with that one.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions, unless if any of the panelists would like to unmute their microphone and ask questions to Dr. Sollenberger. I don't see any. Okay. Andre, were you going to unmute?
I've asked my question. I just want to thank Dr. Sollenberger for today's presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sollenberger. I think we're going to conclude this section. And I'd like to thank the audience for attending this section of Grazing Land Management and Soil Carbon webinar series. Please note that the link to a recording of today's webinar will be available on our website, so please check that out. And also, please plan to join us on our next webinar, which will be on August 5th. And the title of the webinar is Grazing Has a Neutral or Positive Effect on Soil Carbon in Florida Pastures. And the speaker will be Dr. Elizabeth Balton. We hope to see you then. Thank you so much again.